many parents, if not most parents, ask the question, does my son have an addiction? And it's kind of a decision tree issue for them. If he does, he needs treatment. If he doesn't, he does not need treatment. In reality, addiction, full-blown, or addiction that's in the process, or an addiction in the making, if you came to any professional about what do you need to do as far as your therapy strategy to help this person turn it around, there's no difference in the plan for the person who's got an addiction in the making or one that has a full-blown addiction. The same things have to be done in both cases to win or to turn it around. So it's really a moot point. It's a moot question. If you know that he's got an addiction in the making, you need to be very diligent about responding to that with, with all the enthusiasm that you would if you were like, he's been a person with an addiction for many years. You will hear sometimes our therapy staff or me will say he is an addict. But most of the time what you will hear is that he's just a kid or a boy or a young man or a resident that happens to have an addiction. But there are times when a boy is not getting it, and it's like the identity of I am an addict has a little more teeth in it for those that aren't getting it, whereas our reservation is we don't want you to think your primary identification is I am an addict. You are John Doe, a fine young man with a hard head and a big heart who happens to have a brain who has an addiction or an addiction in the making. So it's a little bit of how we see them, how we define them, and honestly the biggest part is how they define themselves when they leave. So then you go to the question, what is an addiction? An addiction, there's thousands of articles and books and et cetera about it to figure out what it is. One, it is not something you can give a test and come out and say, like with diabetes or high blood sugar, or you have a bacterial infection or you're anemic and you've got a number that tells you that. Addiction can't be measured like that. But there's about 10 criteria that you would look at. The two that are most often used by themselves, they kind of encompass everything else, is loss of control, someone who continues to use with negative consequences in their face. So loss of control would be, I didn't mean to use, I thought I was going to drink one, I drank more than I meant to, I wasn't planning on using, but I did, I stopped, but now I've started again. A loss of control over any aspect of the actual intake of the drug in a chemical addiction. And second is they're continuing to do that in spite of having negative consequences in life, consequences from their parents, from school, from friends, from the law, et cetera. And then there's others like tolerance buildup and withdrawal symptoms and things like that. But we define it pragmatically to our parents and to our boys in a little bit more of an operationalized definition that's usable. Basically, addiction is the point at which you get to where, as you move closer to the relapse of whatever you're talking about, whether it's chemical or process, there is a point in time of no return. There is a line at which a person crosses with an addiction that they don't have choice anymore. And when you say that to mostly fathers and to most mothers, my son doesn't have a choice. No, your son has a lot of choice. If he has an addiction, he has a lot of choice on this side of that line that we call the trigger threshold. Once he goes to that point, now addiction means he can't stop it. There's actually a cascading of neurotransmitters and things in the brain that actually it's like an avalanche. We call it the avalanche principle. The avalanche starts, you're not going to stop it. He's going to go until he uses. So your basic line that is the definition of addiction is people with addictions have a line that if they cross it, they're going to relapse. People without addictions, that line doesn't exist. They can go to the point of picking up the bottle and smelling it and putting it down. They can choose to drink and get drunk, but people with addictions can't choose once they've passed that trigger threshold. Now, when you talk about triggers, there are visual sensory triggers of smell and sight and sound and touch, the beating of water on a can of beer. I mean, there's things like that that can be physical triggers. But the more difficult triggers are the triggers that are about the emotions, like hurt, loneliness, and boredom are two of the biggest triggers for our clientele. That those triggers create a need and a thing in the brain called an obsession. I'm obsessing about the promise of the high to take away my bad feeling. And if they get too close with it, it's literally like the trigger on a gun. They put so much pressure on that, boom, it's going to go off and end up in a full relapse. When you talk about addiction, It's not very hard to determine if someone has one, but again, if there's a gray area with a person, it's very, very simple to determine they have one in the making at least, and most parents would agree to that bring their kid here. So then you go to the question, what is an addiction? Most people think addiction is when someone is drinking alcohol or taking some kind of drug, cocaine, smoking pot, etc., and they get addicted to it to the point that they can't say no. But addiction comes in two different categories, general categories. One is a chemical addiction. Well, that is nicotine, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, any kind of drug that a person puts into their body, in their bloodstream, goes to their brain and causes a flooding of the neurotransmitters, and primarily dopamine, the reward center, the pleasure center, is involved in almost all drugs, because it's the neurotransmitter that says, do that again. That's what I'm looking for. And it creates a flooding, meaning higher than you could get in a normal high. If you go out and you love to play basketball and you hit some three-pointers to win the game, or you love to go fishing and you catch a big rainbow trout and you feel great about it, or hold your new baby, it kind of has a ceiling of how high the dopamine release can be. When you take drugs, and alcohol is a liquid drug, it can increase the amount of those neurotransmitters higher than you can do normally. And so that's what ends up making a possibility for addiction to occur, which is an irreversible condition of the brain. So that's chemical addiction. But there's also process addictions. Process addictions are activities that you participate in that can cause the same effect in the brain. People will talk about gambling, gambling compulsivity, sexual addiction. Sexual addiction is not in the DSM at this time, but it has been accepted with ASAM as a part of their definition of addiction. It will eventually be in the DSM, I think. But a process addiction, a sexual addiction, pornography, high-risk sex, a lot of different things that would go under deviant use of sexuality, can cause the dopamine flooding just as much as cocaine can. Matter of fact, for a male to look at moving pornography, it creates an 1100% dopamine potentiation, which is 1100% the amount of dopamine that you can get naturally. That equals the amount of dopamine that is released by crystal meth and crack cocaine. So when you're looking, a male is looking at pornography, and a lot of times parents might find their son on the internet. The average age today for a boy to see pornography for the first time is between the ages of 4 to 8. And it's moving. And in this case, the flooding that's going on is much different than when that 10-year-old boy found the Playboy back in 1950 or 60 or whenever. It's a very different effect. So you see addictions go in more than just single units. You don't just have an addiction to alcohol. There's always something else that goes with it. There are multiple addictions. Most of the time, that's sexual addiction. I think one study showed that 87% of cocaine addicts were also sexual addicts, and 84% of alcoholics were sex addicts. And so when you're looking at the comorbidity of more than one addiction, the way you treat it, in the old days it was get sober and clean from alcohol and you'll be fine, but you started seeing a pattern called an excess deprivation pattern. They would stop using alcohol, but then go to deprivation in it, meaning being sober, and then they would increase their sexuality and start doing excess with that. And so in reality, their brain's not changing at all in the dopamine flooding. They're just changing what makes it happen. So the bottom line connection between relationship or intimacy or core-to-core connection and recovery from addiction is this. If a person with an addiction doesn't get to the point of being healthy enough to have that deep, quality, rich core-to-core relationship with other people, then that void that it creates inside is going to be like a constant magnet pulling something back in that's going to give them at least the illusionary feeling that, oh, that's what I'm looking for. That's the feeling I'm looking for. And that's what these chemical addictions and process addictions do, is release those things in the brain. As a matter of fact, crystal meth, which is a pretty widespread drug that's used and people are addicted to, one of the primary neurochemicals that it releases in the brain is oxytocin. Well, when two people fall in love with each other, one of the primary neurochemicals that is released in the brain is oxytocin. So it's like it's kind of a poignant thing, I think, that they are looking for this thing called real love, and they get it from this drug. So when you look at it that way, I remember Dr. Patrick Carnes, who has written many books on sexual addiction and put together the training for the certified sexual addiction therapist that we have all been through in a section on sexual addiction and on the brain. I remember him coming into the session and saying, addiction, period, chemical and process addiction, is an intimacy disorder, meaning it is an absence of that intimate connection between people.